So this is the last of the autumn quarter of and Matt Albertson is there again for us. Thank you. It's very much appreciated that you hung in there for all four of these, all four books of this series uh, that had all to do. It's outside the lines of Gilded Age baseball, and this is book four. This is the last of the series. Uh, Rob Bauer, the author, who's a PhD, he's at the University of Arkansas then when he wrote these. Bob Bailey has met him a couple of occasions and had wonderful conversations with him. His research is really intriguing, that, the stuff that he's been able to dig out. As I'm reading some stuff, even though I've done like extensive research on the New York Giants of the 1880s, he really gets into explaining a lot about their relationship with Tammany Hall. Anyway, so without too much further ado, I want to introduce Matt, and he is also the co-chair or co-president of the Connie Mack Dick Allen chapter of SABR, which is Greater Philadelphia and Greater Philadelphia. So Bob will normally give some ground rules here. So we have about
16 are here.
16 are here already. So we'll leave it just to somebody signaling with their hand or whatever that they want to say.
Or speak up. Matt will probably throw some questions out there for everybody to respond to.
Right,
Sure.
right. Okay, Matt, are you all set?
Yeah, as good as it's going to get. All right. Thanks, Peter and Bob, for the introductions and for the opportunity to do this again. And thanks for you all for reading all four volumes. It can be kind of a challenge, I think, to stay in one kind of a focus with a particular topic. But fortunately, I think Dr. Bauer's books covered enough topics. We started with alcoholism and gambling and umpires and exercise and, unique topics that don't typically get brought up in 19th century baseball research. And, personally, I thought the sexier topics were the first two books, but I think we can all agree that he truly hit his stride here with the last two, with the Players League book, and then again with the Finances of 1880s Baseball. Just two anecdotes. First, I have noticed that Philadelphia doesn't get a lot of mention in these books, and I'm fine with that because whenever they do, the Philadelphia Quakers is the moniker that's usually used, and that one irritates me. That's a rarely used term in newspapers, locally and across the country. So, secondly, regarding the finances, he tackled quite a few topics that I hadn't particularly thought about before. And I think, as has been par for the course for these four books, I think the focus is really 1885 to 1890 more so than the entire decade. I was hoping that this book might have fleshed out a little bit of finances and baseball of the early 1880s and how that related to the Panic of 1873 and how baseball tried to recover from that. But I didn't see much in the way of that. So what did everybody think about this volume? Let's get it started with a very basic question. Did anybody have anything of note to say? Opinions?
Well, to the point of starting later in the century, that's when the sporting news and sporting life come about, and those are the kind of the go-to sources for so much. He does have a couple of other newspapers where there's obviously the newspapers.com, but it's strongly the SABR available research. But he does add, I think you're right, that he asks some interesting questions. He's not only talking about salaries, but he's getting into how are teams financed, how are they raising capital? How are they maintaining capital? And the interesting thing, one of the interesting things to me is something we see on the field, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, to some extent, were the strong teams on the field. They were also the strong teams financially.
Right.
Also the breakdown of some of the things they covered, like you went into great detail on the Boston team and how it improved after it got Mike Kelly. They listed all the salaries. I don't think I'd ever seen that before, and that was great that he ferreted all that out. And this plus about the tickets, the women's tickets, and the price of tickets. That was it got to really specific things that I had not read before.
I think, it was particularly interesting to read that Arthur Sodden displayed the check that he paid for King Kelly, the $10,000. I really hope
Yeah.
Cohen does the same thing with Juan Soto's contract.
Yeah.
See that displayed in his office. But yeah, so anybody else want to jump in? If not, we can dive into the reserve rule. So he attacks the reserve rule, much like I think we might expect, right? He talked a bit about it with the Players League book, but the evolution of the reserve rule I think was particular interest for me, as it starts from just a few players and then to more players, but he takes it from a different angle, and he brings up this notion that I think comes up in Ken Burns baseball, where some players found it advantageous to be reserved because it was a guarantee of a job for the next season, whereas he's taking it from the magnate standpoint, the ownership standpoint of, this is a way for us to control salaries, a way for us to control how much we're spending on players, because I think the one thing that's remained constant through all the years, Ray, has been owners lamenting how much they pay for players.
Yeah,
Anybody
I thought
have
that
anything on the reserve rule?
yeah, it's so interesting when you think that in baseball, professional infancy, really, just a couple of years into the creation of the National League, they've already begun to institute a reserve rule. First with just a handful of players, and then eventually getting, of course, to the whole roster. And to think that we were sitting here in the 1970s with that rule still being in effect, it goes to say something about the institutionalization of what was done in that era, that Gilded Age, and how it went on to last for decade upon decade through all kinds of different economies and different situations, different economic situations, different social situations. And it wasn't until the 1970s that it was finally abolished. And that is just something like that does not go, how should I say, it doesn't go unnoticed by the government. And the
Well,
government and the
Peter,
courts,
the courts
Yeah,
were
Woody.
very reluctant to do anything about baseball. That's one reason I think, the 1920 monopoly case, they said, well, baseball is not an interstate business, for example. And courts were just reluctant to do anything about it. And I think that's the reason why it lasted so long.
I can remember a
and I thought-
conversation I had with Bill Lamb after he retired as a prosecutor. But anytime you look at the cases in the 1800s, the owners lost almost all of them. There was never, it was a rare situation, but they were almost all in local or state courts. It was never a federal case
Right.
that was brought. And I just asked Bill if you win 3 or 4 of these things, and guys, not that they become free agents, but they don't lose the blacklist goes away. one point and various things of that nature. Why did it happen? He just said the only thing he could come up with is that once they got a decision and won for that guy, he never wanted to push it any further, and there was never any organized. Even with the Brotherhood, there was never an organized effort to adjudicate these things.
To follow up on what Woody said too, is that, you know, there's a reason why Kennesaw Mountain Landis' biography is called Judge and Jury. You know, he's rewarded very handsomely for dragging his feet on the case that involved the Federal League, and dragging his feet to the point that, you know, that the Federal League is gone, and you know, suddenly he emerges and is rewarded by the magazine as the you know, the emperor of baseball, lack of a better word. But it is to see those roots being developed that early on, and I think the players had something really going against them in a way, is that they were earning so much more, probably 7 times at least, 7 times more than the average working man in the United States at that time, and maybe even more in many cases. And they were seen as a little bit, oh, for only 6 months worth of work, you know, and they had all of that going against them, as in terms of you know, getting any equity or any getting into management at all. I remember reading a history of the city of New York, and the first guys to become unionized in New York were the shore workers, or better known as longshoremen. Well, the Panic of 1873 hit those longshoremen and brought their wages down to $4 a week. It wasn't until World War One that they got back to where they were before, at $5 a week.
So the reserve rule, I think we're pretty familiar with, but I think I learned in this book that it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't a monolith to the owners or the players, right? It wasn't just a set and dry kind of rule. There were ways to evade it. There were ways to enforce it. There were unique ways for ownership to use it forcefully to their own advantage. Hoping we can dive into some of those. So one of them, I think, was you know, when you have primarily most of your team reserved for the next season, well, what's to say you can't create a pseudo farm system and add more players to your roster? So, I mean, what does that do for the economy of baseball when teams are reserving more than they really needed?
I think the example of that was in the late 80s, early 90s with John Brush, because he owned Cincinnati and he owned Indianapolis in the Western League. And he used that as a farm system. He controlled about 40 players instead of the 14 or so that were allowed on the major league roster, which was essentially the whole roster for all practical purposes. But other teams started to make arrangements with minor league teams that they could hide players, because you had the draft pop up in 1891 that starts. So various things. The owners looked out for the owners. They didn't care if the other owners broke the rules, as long as it didn't affect them. But they were going to make sure that the players were under control. And I think a lot of the idea to start with was, we can't make money because of all the revolving that's going on in the 1870s. So this reserve lets me save my core players. And then it just started to expand from there, till finally they said, Not only is that, but they now have no other place to go because you start watching the league constitution moving through saying, if you do any of these 5 or 8 or the dozen things, you're blacklisted. You can't be signed by anybody, and the control remains with the team you initially signed with until Spalding figured out he wasn't going to have a championship team anymore and started to sell players for $10,000 a pop.
So we have the ability here of owners to suppress salaries or at least control them initially, to control them at the major league level, particularly once the national agreement is put into place. The war is over between the NL and the AA. But that means that these clubs are now free to pilfer the minor leagues, which aren't subject to the national agreement. And then there comes a time when they think to themselves, why not put the minor leagues also under the same umbrella? Why don't we reserve minor league players? What are the advantages and disadvantages of reserving players in the minor leagues for major league clubs?
Well, I think that the owners in those type of decisions, for example, what are the pros and cons of doing this? Really, you're going to lean on the fact that they ultimately are going to control it. They're ultimately, like you say, they're going to make the decisions to treat this guy this way and treat that guy that way. They're always leaving themselves that flexibility to kind of make it come out in their favor, for lack of a better word. And you see that throughout almost everything that he talks about finances. You know, it's interesting to me, even in in various revenue streams. Even ticket prices. Well, I had the better seats, but they always had the better seats closer to the field. You know, the way it works today, really. But I went to Yankee Stadium a few years ago. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But parking your car.
Yeah. And so with, the advantage, of course, is then you don't have to pay exorbitant amounts of money for the minor league player. These are capitalists after all, Gilded Age capitalists. So you don't have to overpay for minor league talent that may or may not work out for you at the major league level. But at the same time, it also protects the minor leagues, which I don't know if they particularly cared about at the major league ownership level, but it did protect the minor leagues. It protected teams in smaller towns and cities to keep them going, which was an advantage for the major league because they use it not as a farm, but for lack of a better term, a farm. But then there's this occasional major league that pops up, like the Union Association. And I'm not going to dive too much into that because I'm not Justin McKinney and I'm not the authority on it. But, we have a couple players that jump from the National League over to the UA and then they're blacklisted. So one of these muscles that the NL owners seek to flex is, what, if you're going to go outside the national agreement, you can do that. You can break your contract, but there's going to be hell to pay if you want to come back. Naturally, this is high-end talent. This is great talent that isn't available just on a tree, right? So they do want the players back, but they're going to use this blacklist. What are the pros and cons of the blacklist for the owners? It eventually does die.
Oh, yeah. I was amazed to see how the owners would apply that blacklist again to their favor. They would make the certain exceptions, as long as it came out to their benefit. If they saw a guy as truly, truly problematic, irredeemable, then he was truly blacklisted. If they had any notion that they could turn him around, well, then they would ignore the blacklist.
I
And they
know.
would
I'm
do,
not sure it was a rehabilitation mindset as much as they saw value in the player. Uh, and you take a look, Tony Mullane is probably the best example, having to sit out a year because of his problems with Cincinnati and St. Louis, going through all that. But you just didn't see that. Uh, President of the National League, Mills, quit the job in late 1884, early 1885, because they wiped out all the players they blacklisted. They had the rule: you sign with the unions, you're gone forever. And then they started saying, well, I'd like this guy. And everybody started making exceptions to let them in. So I think you're right. It's the National League owners were looking out for themselves in two ways. One, how do we protect the league? And that's how the reserve rule initially came through, to stop rotation, revolving and whatnot. But then I'm not going to bother the other teams as long as they're not using it to hurt me.
One thing I found out in my own research from my talk and next month is that I think it was Halbert who passed got a rule passed that said that the National League teams, or excuse me, the minor league teams could not nab a National League player, but the National League owners had no compunction for going the other way around. And they had, Jack Burdock was signed to a minor league team in 1875, but Hubbard swooped in and grabbed him. And had no compunction about doing that. And I have found all these comments about how, why should the players obey the rules when the team owners won't even do that? I mean, time and time again.
But they would always get high and mighty and say, yeah, but under the Constitution, we make the rules.
Yes.
So they would pass a rule and they say, we're not making a one-time rule as much as we're amending the Constitution.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. Right. And I think for me, one of the cooler chapters was earlier on about the 1886 salary limits. And, I've read, a couple times, well, yeah, they might have only made $2,000, but, they made more money on the side sometimes. And it seemed to me like, even though the owners put this into place, nobody followed the rule. Everybody disregarded it. Vehemently, whether it was public, some were very public with it, and didn't care. So I don't understand the point of putting this into place. Maybe it's a way to suppress the overall salaries of, your filler players, and maybe not necessarily your King Kellys or Tony Mullanes or anything like that, but to suppress the salaries greatly of those players that just came and went. Because what we see in the book is Sodom put together one hell of a baseball club in Boston, and he's like Steve Cohen. Like, I kept thinking Steve Cohen, in this, he's going to spend as much money as possible to put the best product on the field as possible. Whatever he had to do, he was going to do, and that's how I interpreted, or that's how I felt. Bauer's presenting Sodden here. So, thoughts on the 1886 salary limitation? Did you have any anecdotes in that particular chapter that jumped out at you that were bizarre, strange, or interesting?
well, I think Chris Von, he in St. Louis, I mean, uh, he played that like a violin. I mean, he knew every trick in the book. Every you make a guy, you give him the captainship, or you give him some kind of additional job at the ballpark, whatever it was. He was going to, do what he wanted to do. And you're right. I think everybody was just kind of winking at it after a while. And by the way, I mean, the players were certainly aware of that. They were certainly aware. I mean, they were right in tune with it. And that, in a way, kind of shaped their view. And as as things became more aggressive in terms of salary cap, it became you know, they saw it more, I think, as hypocritical after what went on and, with the 1886 salary cap, that they saw any future salary cap as truly hypocritical, that it wasn't, really meant to apply.
There was no central enforcement authority. So they could get away with just about anything they did because nobody was going to slap them on the wrist or fine them or throw them out of owning a baseball team. So, I mean, whatever you think about the Kennesaw Mountain Landises of the world, once somebody became in charge, it started to have an enforcement. It may have been enforcement in the wrong way, but it was enforcement. People understood that, well, there were some limits. You couldn't just do things on your own.
Yeah, Landis went right after, the St. Louis club in the 20s and early 30s, when it was building essentially their own, I forget how many teams they had, 30 something teams like in their farm system. Somebody like Branch Rickey, was gobbling up all the best players under his system, and as Jerry points out about going after the, the owners in a sense and keeping them in line to some degree. Yeah, you have to give it credit for that, and not always, not always for the right reasons.
If you take a look at the 1880s and the 1980s, I think collusion in the 1980s was the exact same thing as we're seeing here. How do I control salaries, whether it's because I don't follow the rules or I collude with people and we agree not to do it? It's the same thing they were doing back in 1880s. How do I find a way to lower my cost? And my biggest cost is player salaries. I'd fight with the railroads to get as best I could, and I'd go to a second class hotel if I wanted to save some money. But if I didn't control my salaries, that was going to be what, 60% of their costs?
But that was right after Kurt Flood, and all of a sudden they weren't paying their top player $125,000. They were paying a lot more.
Indeed, right.
They were reacting basically.
For the same reasons that the folks in the 1880s were reacting, because they put the $2,000 in, then they put, I forget what was the interim right after that, but then you get the brush classification system, which topped out amazingly at $2,000, and the Players League popped up. And then they couldn't do that again. In 1891, they drafted minor league players for a pittance.
I think, something else Bauer brings up is, in a couple of places, obviously the better the player, the more interested the public is going to be. So, in his chapter on attendance figures, Boston did great in attendance.
Mm-hmm.
The ballpark itself was gorgeous, the South End grounds, after 1887, 88, that phenomenal ballpark designed by John Deere. The field was crap. We can get to that later, but you've got great talent on the field. So he's spending on these things that people want to enjoy, the refreshments, nice seating, the wonderful views, and a great baseball team. And I think we find, Major League wide, the owners don't have this aversion of spending money on players, but they have an aversion to paying players a lot of money. But at the same time, they realize, you know what? If we have this arbitrary $2,000 salary cap in place or whatever it may be, these best players who, like I said earlier, aren't like, low-hanging fruit. They're not just growing on trees everywhere. What's the incentive for them to play harder? What's their incentive to improve their game, to get better, whatever they do? If I can make $2,000 and I'm a household name, well, I'm just going to rest on my laurels and play good baseball and maybe not overextend my talent. So I thought that was kind of a way for the players to push back. Ultimately, it worked in a sense because ownerships recognize, you know what, we're gonna have to pay these players more. We're gonna have to pay old Hoss Radburn more money. We're gonna have to pay Fred Dunlap, more money. We're gonna have to pay these guys to an extent.
Think I like the part where Bauer said that he implied anyway that the owners didn't mind paying for the players. Then it suddenly dawned on them that there were only a finite number of the good players, and after all, everyone's going to be after them, and then the salaries are going to go up and up and up and up, and that's what they really didn't. That's what owners didn't really like. But I guess they didn't mind more like 10, all the money from Mike Kelly of Boston was it $4,000? I think his salary it said was. But just all the competition for the good ones, and that's what hurt them in the pocketbook, so to speak.
Yeah, I saw that Boston salary structure also, Jack, that caught my eye. That Kelly was making 4,000, but
Yeah,
a couple of guys were in the threes,
yeah.
then it went down to the twos and below. And it's kind of interesting, it's kind of interesting where Kelly was, how he was viewed, and they understood by putting, you know, Kelly on the field, it meant so many more, fannies and seats, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's ultimately what's important. And for some clubs, uh, obviously visitors and people in seats matter. That's what's paying most of the bills, aside from advertisers. And we can jump into that a little bit about how clubs made money. But the one thing I found really fascinating was how the National League owners truly sabotaged Detroit after 1887. And I think it's pretty brilliant by the Detroit ownership. We've got a limited population here. It's one of the smaller populations in the National League. But we need to bring in talent, but we're going to bring in that talent so it draws visitors on the road, right? Spectators on the road, to bring in that high dollar value because we're going to get 50% of the gate. And then the National League owners say, you know what? We're going to give you a set fee. It's going to be $130, $150, totally screwing Detroit. I can't believe that they actually would sabotage themselves like that, but then you read the reasons why and it makes a little bit of sense. Anybody have any thoughts on the Detroit situation?
Detroit did some different things. They bought Indianapolis. They bought Buffalo, which was a major league team at the time, because they wanted certain players from Sam Thompson to Dan Bruthers and Deacon White and whatnot. And they built, a core that was in 2 years the World Series champions. But you're right. The nobody wanted to see that money pass out of the league. And they didn't want to suddenly say, wow, I have to go to Detroit and not make any money. Why are they making money coming into my place? And there's always the idea between a set fee, a dollar amount that you got per game, and a percentage was a fight for 15 years. Some teams moved from the American Association to the National League over that.
I had read Mike Wallace's History of the City of New York, and the way he handled it was going back all the way to the Dutch and before. But the way he handled it was almost by decade. That's how he told the history, very chronological. But in each decade, he discussed various elements of society. What women were doing in this decade, or what was happening politically in this decade, or what was happening, uh, economically in this decade, and commerce and so forth and so on, expansion of the city. And when you look at the 1880s decade, uh, it's those robber barons of the 1880s that are the role models for these, these baseball owners. They're the role, they're the guys that they're looking up to being. They want to be in that crowd, you know, they want to be considered to be those people. You know, I remember something striking me one time, and Mike Wallace and the other fellow he co-wrote with Burroughs. They brought up, for example, in the 1880s, how much a gown cost. First of all, they all came from France. So the wives and daughters of these robber barons were wearing these $3,000 gowns, and they had about 30 of them to wear for the season. So it gives you a sense of what the era was about.
Yeah, it's called Gilded for a reason, right?
Yeah.
If I could direct your attention to page 145, if you have your book on you. I do like some of the charts that Bauer puts in here, and this is in particular attendance for games featuring Detroit in 1886. And I'm astounded at how well Detroit's plan worked to get more people on the road due to gate receipts. The largest attendance centers, we have New York, then Philadelphia, and then Chicago, the three largest cities, unsurprisingly. 189,000 total attendance for New York in 1886, but nearly 34% of those people watched games against Detroit. And then in Philly, just over 27%, and in Chicago, an extraordinary almost half of the attendance was Chicago versus Detroit. So I mean these teams are raking in money because of the great talent that's on the field. 1886 Philadelphia has their third highest winning percentage in club history. That's still their third highest winning percentage in club history. New York, obviously very good, and Chicago, who didn't like their chances to win the pennant, that year. So these clubs are raking in the money. And speaking of that, we found that not not even the big clubs were making the money, not the most populous cities. Even clubs like Louisville and Kansas City are actually recording profits, even after you consider they're paying the player salaries. They have to pay maybe rent for the ballpark. They have to pay to, all the vendors and all the people that work at the ballpark. They're still making a profit on all of this, which I think I didn't see, I haven't seen it written that authoritatively, I guess I would say, anywhere else, and as succinctly. Anybody else have any thoughts on profits by ownership in Major League Baseball in the 1880s?
Matt, you mentioned the table on 145. On 144, it talks about the White Stockings and how it expressed resentment over the visitors, supporting visitors with 30% of the take when those visitors did not reciprocate. In my own White Stocking research, that was such a big, big deal. There was a major article in the Chicago papers, and probably that might be the same one they're talking about here. And they had it all laid out, almost the way they did on page 145 there, with all the amount of money that the teams were bringing in was not nearly as much money as when Chicago played those teams on the road.
So again, looking at this 145 and going back to what Jack is saying, we're talking about attendance, and attendance is dollars. Does it truly benefit the owners to slightly fabricate attendance, maybe put their thumb on the scale, so to speak, to make it a little bit heavier?
Well, he makes a point in the book about that. He makes a point about there's the reasons for doing it and what are the negative, what is the negative impact of doing it? The negative impact, of course, is that the players are also seeing those statistics, and and of course anybody who's in the brotherhood is pointing out oh, the owners said they drew this many, and where is our cut of that? And so it was a two-edged sword. There's one thing to be trying to attract stockholders and so forth and so on by talking about your numbers being high, or even the general public, and then the feeling that our team is drawing this many, and that's good for our city and so forth and so on, and good for baseball next year. And at the same time, the flip side is, what do the players think?
Well, it probably depended on what was the problem at the moment. When the Players League was there, you up the attendance because you wanted to beat out the Players League, and somebody wrote that there was never a game that you had an honest attendance reported anywhere in it during that 1890 season. But you don't always see attendance in the box score. If you're drawing 212 people, you might not want to see that. You might not report it to the reporters and let them know that there's 43 people out there. Red Barber told them to put the in Yankee Stadium, put the camera out there and show them all those empty seats, and he was unemployed the next year.
It's yeah, that's an interesting point, right? So as some of you may know, I did some research on the 1895 most popular Philly, and that was heavily based on attendance records and how a certain team of power hitters and great offensive players could impact attendance. And this makes me realize that I might have built that research on a house of cards a little bit, because some of those numbers could be, swayed one way or another. And I like the way Bauer put it in this book that if we take, an 1888 game between Chicago and Boston, it's in April, and the recorded attendance according to the Boston Gazette Boston Globe is 4,583. Where are they getting the number from? Because it's not an official stat until, I think he says, after 1891. Well, that's coming from the club, and that's where the reporters are getting it from. So even though it seems like an exact number, that number might be a little bit inflated, although not terribly. But I just thought that point was a little interesting. Anything else on attendance?
Well, the fact that it didn't become official until after 1891 might have had something to do with the big league, the 12-team league, and this, being the only quote major league, and them deciding finally to, let's not play this game anymore. We don't have to, because we own it all, and we have what we wanted. By the way, that book sat on my shelf for about 2 years. David Boyd's book, The League That Failed. And I thought it was about the American Association. And finally, one day I decided, why don't we read this book by David Boyd? I pulled it out. And of course, it's the decade following this decade. I only wish I knew before I read that book a number of years ago, what was really transpiring, what kind of owners there were in the 1880s. I had a sense of it, but I didn't have those numbers like Rob Bauer puts out there, and that kind of information, because the guys are the same owners in the 1890s for the most part, and they're even more horrible than they were in the 1880s.
One topic that came up in this book reminded me of Level Playing Fields by Peter Morris, which we read, I think it was last year, that a lot of owners in the 1880s didn't particularly care for putting money into the field. They mentioned that Boston's triumvirate just kind of let the field go to pot. Philadelphia had a terrible field in 1887, evidently, and only Detroit somehow had a truly a field as flat as a billiard table, as everybody said. And they didn't realize at the time that that this could be an advantage for you if you had a well manicured field. Um, how are teams bringing in revenue in the 1880s?
I thought
What's
it
bringing
was
people to the ballpark?
I thought it was interesting when they talked about selling the scorecards and the advertising space, and of course the food. But I'd forgotten that they had toboggans too, and that reminded
Yeah.
me from my Chicago research how Cap Anson was really big on the toboggans in the West Side Park there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't come up here. I can't recall if it's the 1887 Philadelphia ballpark or the second rendition in 1895, where Philadelphia's ownership builds a bicycle racing track around the entire field for use when they weren't playing baseball there, and then you have, for lack of a better term, an amusement park in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chicago had a bicycle rink too in one of its stadiums. I can't remember which one, but at least one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When they finally realized that they could sell advertising space on fences, I mean, it really did, do a lot to improve the ballparks by, making sure that they were kind of, they had like a kind of formula. They knew, as they were putting up the fence might have cost them, $4,000 or $5,000 to put up, but they understood they had the idea that we can really pay for this fence through advertising. Within a couple of years, this fence is really paid for.
Right. Another thing was location, location, location. We realized that Staten Island's not a good place to put a ballpark in the 19th century.
Still, it's neither is it in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Even
We're
if
still sitting there.
even if you do own the ferry lines to get people there. So location's part of driving attendance too. And I thought it was interesting how the Mets ballpark, even though it was in a poor neighborhood, in a bad neighborhood, it was more ideal than placing them in Staten Island, which I think kind of makes sense to me. But the Giants and the Jets have made it work, so I guess that's kind of irrelevant. But the transportation modes are a little different now.
It was $31 million in 1995. $31 million to erect that ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point it was sitting empty. Now, fortunately, the Atlantic League is starting to revive it. In fact, it just last night gave out a prize to my trivia contest to Staten Island Baseball Times for 4 tickets to a game that was donated by the Atlantic League team that's been at a Ferry Hawks.
Right, right.
I think the owners had a sense that the ballpark was a draw, but they didn't want to put any money in it. Whenever they built it, they said, "Oh, this is the finest ballpark in the land." I must have read that a dozen times when a new grandstand was built. They called them the Grand Duchess. They gave them names and whatnot. But as you say, when you read about the field, when you read about the amenities there, nobody traveled. There weren't 15 people from Indianapolis who traveled to Washington to watch a ball game. It wasn't like we have today with we're back to the transportation system helping that. So everybody could claim we're as good as everybody else because nobody else saw whatever anyone had.
Mm-hmm.
And who's going to believe the reporter when he says this ballpark's better than ours?
Right. I thought it was interesting. I think you mentioned at one point in the book that um, it kind of reminded me of European soccer, where the away team gets an allotment of seats, at the opposing stadium. And this got proposed, and I thought to myself, with the problems Bauer's talking about with the amount of train travel required to go, not just in the Northeast or in the West at the time, right? It's, who's going to go from Indianapolis to New York on a train to cheer on a really bad Hoosiers team? I don't know if that that allotment thing works out very well immediately and it just completely gets disposed of or not. But speaking of East and West, that's another one of the topics he talks about with you know, the one of the many expenses that ownership has to contend with, and why when, you know, the American Association New York Club gets absorbed basically and pilfered, they have to scramble and they finally settle on Kansas City, which is the best of a bad situation. Any comments on league formation, setup, maintaining certain cities and leagues?
Well, you need at least two factors to put a new team in somewhere. First, you've got to have enough population that you have some reasonableness that you can draw sufficient people to pay for everything. But secondly, you've got to have somebody in the town who's willing to put up the money to get it started. Because they've got to get a lease on a ballpark or build a grandstand. They've got to pay, contract with players and be ready to put some working capital into this thing. It's not an inexpensive sort of thing, but I do think a lot of the smaller towns that did it for vanity purposes. Because now you're major league.
Right. And that actually came up when the Seattle Supersonics moved to Oklahoma City. There wasn't this whole discussion around what you see in 20th, 21st century, like we want to revitalize this part of town, we want to grow business in this area. It was, we just want to be a major league city, point blank. And in today's society, that's an honest answer that everybody can say, okay, well, whether I want this or not, whether I want to have my taxes go towards that or not, at least they were honest with me. It's not, you know, feeding me a bunch of crow, but it's not necessarily the same kind of situation. I don't think in 1880s baseball where, you know, should Kansas City have been a major league city after failing the first time? Maybe, maybe not, but they were. That's all that mattered. Toledo, same kind of thing. Anything else on ballparks, league formation, maintaining the size of a league?
Well, you had the early days of impinging on the minors. Kansas City was an example because the Kansas City Major League team had the worst ballpark in town, and the minor league Western League had, because they owned the ballpark, had the top scale ballpark. And these things would go back and forth, and the leagues would get involved trying to get the owners of the Western League Kansas City team to become a National League team, although they continued to fight about train rides from St. Louis to Kansas City.
And now just thinking about it, do I remember correctly that one of they mentioned one of the devices for owners to profit when the team wasn't there was to bring in, you know, other sorts of entertainment. And they mentioned in Washington, they brought in a circus after opening weekend and the field was trashed, you know, for the rest of the season. So like they, you know, the groundskeepers did a great job on the field. Thanks a lot. The rest of the summer, it's going to be a polo field.
It was an interesting point he made because he got into, you know, teams either owning fields or some other arrangement, you know, some kind of rental arrangement or whatever. And, you know, it got into, you know, that the teams that own their fields, for the most part, were a little bit more successful financially. I mean, you know, which, you know, makes sense, of course, to, you know, but, you know, I thought it was interesting that he even brought that up.
Yeah, I thought that the chapter on ballparks could have been expanded a little bit more. I would have liked to have read a little bit more about the situation in New York in particular with the Polo Grounds and, you know, the city, you know, cutting streets through it, which New York wasn't the only situation where that happened. It was, you know, a risk for every other city in the league pretty much.
Yeah, but Tammany Hall had it down to a science.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You know, complete the grid, you know, or else.
Yeah, there's a
And,
different
you
set
know,
of
I found it fascinating. And I've done a lot of research on the you know, early giants of this era and Mutri and so forth. And I found it tremendously interesting what they were actually, you know, because he cites here, and I don't know where, you know, in fact, I looked at it. I think it was in one of the, like, Sporting Life or something. That was the source.
What?
He cites the actual number of season passes, books of passes that they gave out to Tammany Hall, and it was sizable. I mean, it was $3,000 worth of season of tickets, you know, a season.
Yeah. And it's not like today where you're hoping to recoup that in jersey, t-shirt, hat sales, hot dogs, hamburgers. You know, I in here he mentioned a comment from Al Reach about them being a moral guy and not wanting to sell beer at the ballpark, saying we could make $5,000 selling liquor at the ballpark. And I thought he would love to buy $13 beer at Citizens Bank Park today because they are rolling in the dough, you know, you know, in concession prices. We're coming up against it, so I guess we can fire off any other points at the end of the book if you wish, whether it's Millennium Plan, Players League, otherwise.
I just thought,
I've always been enamored of the millennial plan, well, partially because it never went anywhere. And it's Francis Richter has these ideas, and they're so idealistic they can't work.
you know, this book is a very good example. Normally we get alerted by SABR if somebody has joined SABR and has an interest in 19th century baseball, and then we in turn send out a letter telling that individual, an email telling that individual that welcome to our 19th century committee, and we hope you'll participate, so forth. And the other day I got a letter back saying, "Oh, I'm so excited, but I'm such a novice, and I wish I could learn more." And I remember saying, I was thinking of these books, and remember saying back to him, "Read, read, read."
Yeah, there's so much to learn, and in that vein, Peter, some of the people on this call have been researching 19th century baseball for longer than I've been alive. So once you get over the fact that that might be a little intimidating, don't worry about your journey. Just read it at your own pace and find your niche, and it'll go well.
Very true.
Anybody have anything else? Jack, Woody?
Well,
Good job.
good job, Matt. Real good job.
Yeah, nice job, man.
Appreciate it.
As always.
And looking forward to covering the original Louisville Slugger by Tim Newby here in a couple of months.
That's right. In March. That's for everybody safe who's online here will know it's going to be on March the 20th. And Matt will be back with the third book of our winter quarter of 3 months. So we have books in January. Our next one being on January the 21st with Paul Langren again, and Langendorfer, and he is Baseball in Blue and Gray, which is of course about Civil War baseball. And that book is about over 20 years old. So it's interesting to see, what we know since then. But it's a jump off point. And he has 2 books on the Civil War. The other is Playing for a Kingdom, which is a novel about a Civil War game that he's doing in February. So Paul will be here in January and February with those 2 books that are Civil War based, and Matt will be back, as he mentioned, with it's really a bio of Pete Browning. who was our very first, by the way, who was our very first Overlook Baseball legend, which is kind of interesting.
Peter, what's the date for the February one?
February is going to be the 18th.
Okay. I know he sent the email, but I forgot to write them down.
Yeah, yeah, they are.
Okay.
Matt, thank you so much again. You did an excellent job. Bob, thank you for getting us up and running and hosting.
I want to wish everyone a happy holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah the day after Christmas, I believe is when I've never seen it start after Christmas, but that, I probably just don't remember well at my age.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Enjoy the season.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
and
again, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Mhm.